Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Barry Williams, Chairman of the Ironbridge Gorge Museums Trust, and I am very pleased to welcome you all to Coalbrookdale this evening. 2017 is a year of celebration for the Trust as we mark our 50th anniversary. Over the course of this year, we have had a wide programme of activities, and the lecture today is one of those highlights. The Ironbridge Lecture is run in conjunction with the University of Birmingham through the Ironbridge International Institute of Cultural Heritage. The Trust enjoys a 30-year partnership with the Institute, and we are pleased to welcome many of the postgraduate students as well as the staff from the university here this evening. I am delighted to now introduce our speaker for this evening, Loyd Grossman, CBE. Loyd started his career in journalism with Harper's and Queen, and then the Sunday Times, before moving into television, where many of you will know him from the programmes including MasterChef and Through the Keyhole. Loyd has a lifetime interest in history, the arts and heritage. He is a former commissioner of the Museums and Galleries Commission. He was chairman of the Museums Advisory Committee and the Blue Plaque Panel, a former commissioner of the Royal Commission on the Historical Monuments of England, a founder member of the Museums, Libraries and Archives Council, past chairman of National Museums Liverpool, and of the Public Monuments and Sculpture Association, and past president of the British Association of Friends of Museums. He founded the 24-Hour Museum, now Culture 24, and was its chairman until 2005. In 2009, he was appointed chairman of the Heritage Alliance, which represents over 100 non-governmental and voluntary organisations working in the heritage sector. Loyd is involved with many other organisations, including being Vice President of the Church's Conservation Trust, Emeritus Governor of the LSE, a member of the board of the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions, and a governor of the Building Crafts College. Loyd is a patron of the Association for Heritage Interpretation and patron of Heritage Open Days. And in 2016, Loyd was appointed chairman of the Royal Parks. He is involved with a number of the London livery companies, and June 15, he was appointed CBE in recognition of his services to heritage. Loyd is a keen guitarist, and he and his band, The New Forbidden, made their 7th appearance at Glastonbury in June 2017. Sorry, Loyd. I'm sure you will all agree Loyd's resume is hugely impressive, and we are extremely privileged that he has been able to come to Ironbridge this evening. The topic of his lecture is Heritage in the Post-Truth World. This is certainly a topic that's very pertinent given recent global events. Following the lecture, Loyd will be happy to take any questions from the floor, and we have a couple of roving mics to help for you to do this. It's now my pleasure to ask you to welcome and to hand over to Loyd.
Thanks for that, Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, it is slippery. I was warned. That was a mostly accurate introduction. It was such a relief quite often. I was being introduced the other day by someone who said, what you probably don't know about Loyd is that he's performed 7 times at Glyndebourne. And, I thought that, you know how difficult it is to get tickets to Glyndebourne? I thought, can you imagine you save up for 2 years to get a ticket to Cozy fan tutti, and I appear on stage? Be a bit of a disappointment. I'm very, very grateful to the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust and to the University of Birmingham for inviting me here to do this lecture. And it's particularly special because of the 50th anniversary of the Ironbridge Gorge Museum. So thank you very much. And thank you all very much for missing the Rome versus Chelsea match this evening, and trick-or-treating as well. So I feel doubly flattered that you've come here to listen to me. And what I want to do is I want to explain the context in which heritage operates and the way in which heritage is changing. You know, we have this idea that heritage is somehow fixed, but it's not. It's evolving all the time. The way we define it is changing. The way we care for it is changing. And what it does for society and within society is changing. So I want to explore some of the ways in which the heritage context changes and how that is changing what we do with heritage and what we feel about heritage. You probably don't need to be reminded that we've lived through a crazy couple of years. And I mean, if you thought that was disruptive, you know, then along comes this guy. And the thing is that the kind of events like Brexit, like the election of Trump, and other global events are, of course, partially produced by something that I call the Metatrends. And of course, a Metatrend is a trend that's even bigger than a mega trend. You know, Metatrend is something that's going to be around for years and years and years. And the Metatrends that I think most affect the heritage are these 4, which I'm going to explain: the shrinking state, the death of expert opinion, people power, which we could also call democratization, and then, of course, globalization, which is the meta-trend that we've all been very familiar with for at least the last 15 or 20 years. But as a caution, I just want to say that not everything that is going to happen can even be vaguely predicted. You know, making guesses about the future is a mug's game. I mean, no one could explain this, could they? So, you know, one has to take all prognostications about the future with more than a grain of salt. I like the remark that an American futurologist made, where he said, the only thing we can be certain about in the future is that all events will have a beginning, a middle, and an end, although not necessarily in that order. So that's well worth remembering. You know, any predictions about the future are almost inevitably going to be wrong. But I want to look first at the trend of the shrinking state. I don't know if anyone remembers this wonderful film, The Incredible Shrinking Man. Following an atomic accident, a scientist began getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's kind of what's happening with the state in terms of its involvement in the arts, in culture, and in heritage. And a good example of this may be to look at what happened to the organization that was the Old English Heritage. So we go back to 1913. And 1913 marked the first really significant legislation. Welcome, the bus arrived. Happy Halloween. 1913 marked the first big intervention by the government in terms of protection of the heritage. And then, as if to celebrate the centenary of that, the government decided to break English heritage into 2 bodies. And this is enormously symbolic because it shows that after 100 years of a great degree of state intervention in the heritage, the state was pulling back. So English heritage was split into two bodies, one unsurprisingly called English Heritage, which handles all the kind of regulatory stuff, and the other one called Historic England, which looks after attractions like Stonehenge, et cetera, et cetera. And while this symbolized a declining interest of the state in the preservation of the heritage, there was also a certain element of good sense in it, because English heritage was always slightly an organization in which two brains lived in one body. English heritage was always rather conflicted between its role as a runner of historic attractions and its role as a regulator. So in fact, the division of English heritage in two seemed to be quite sensible and seems to be working pretty well so far. As English heritage, as we knew it, was on its last legs, there was a lot of nostalgia about it, and there was an interest in looking at the history of government protection of the heritage, exemplified, for example, by Simon Thurley's excellent book, Men from the Ministry. And the subtitle is really quite important, How Britain Saved Heritage. Now, the implication is, when you call something Men from the Ministry, the implication is that the government stepped in and saved heritage, which of course is not true, because from the very beginning, the very foundation of the heritage movement, it's been all about very passionate individuals. For example, William Morris, the great aesthetic socialist, Octavia Hill, founder of the National Trust. These were the people that saved the heritage. And it was only after their work, after their commitment, after their dedication, that the state felt it had to come in and do things as well. So let's not forget that we may actually be reverting to the old style of heritage, in which a much greater part of the burden is on us as individuals rather than on the state through its various agencies. Now, the one thing that is certain about the state is that they spend less and less money on heritage every year. Now, those boxes don't have cash in them. They are empty, and they've been empty, relatively empty for the heritage, throughout a number of governments of all different colors. So it's not a particularly partisan thing. Governments, since around 2000, have been reining back their spending on heritage. And of course, they can explain it in various different ways. The huge demands of social care, of the National Health Service, the increasing demands of security, and so on, mean that there is less and less state money to invest in heritage. And this, of course, has a number of implications. It means that all heritage organizations are looking more and more for individuals like this. The super rich, the ultra high net worth individuals are being courted so competitively by heritage organizations. But it's also important to realize that everyone has a role to play. And we do, in the new climate, have to encourage a much greater amount of more modest donations by a much broader base of the public. And that's why, for example, friends organizations are so important. Because not only do they mobilize goodwill, not only do they help to raise money, they also show that there is a real social commitment, that the community itself wants these heritage attractions, heritage icons, to be looked after properly for the future. Now, the other metatrend number 2, is what I call the death of expert opinion. And part of this is related to the decline of deference. England was a very deferential society. This is the famous photograph of Eton schoolboys being looked at rather curiously by some local residents of Slough. And it just shows that we had, for hundreds of years, a very, very deferential society. And it was deference not only in social terms and in economic terms, but also intellectual deference was built in to the English psyche. Then along came the very disruptive period of the late 60s. That's my generation. And one of the things that we hated was deference. You know, it was all about demolishing deference, and this has had unintended consequences. The first one is that we ended up looking like this, which is rather unfortunate. The other unintended consequence is that we began to lose our respect for intellectual authority. So I'm going to give you an analogy from the food world, and then I'll take us into heritage. Now, I don't know if anyone, well, we remember that famous statement. This was during the run-up to Brexit, where Michael Gove said, people in this country have had enough of experts. And, you know, I sort of thought, when he said that, I thought, so you don't go to a dentist then, or you don't get your car repaired by someone who knows what they're doing. But there has been a revolt against expertise. Now, I'm going to go into the analogy with food. Can anyone recognize this person? This is someone who's called Egon Ronay. And when I first arrived in this country in 1974, no one would dare go to a restaurant or a hotel without looking in their copy of Egon Ronay's hotel and restaurant guide. And if it was in that guide, you felt it was safe to go there. You could go there, but you always looked in the guide. You never went anywhere without looking in the Egon Ronay guide. And then came along this very disruptive influence in the form of two lawyers from New York called Tim and Nina Zagat, who liked going to restaurants. And they had a brilliant idea, and their brilliant idea was this. They said, well, why should we read a guidebook written by a restaurant critic when our friends and ourselves go to restaurants all the time? So if we just put everyone's opinion together, we'll have a much better picture of what's good and what's bad than just relying on one person. Yeah? And of course, the consequence of that is TripAdvisor. Now, how many people here use TripAdvisor? Tell the truth, yes? Yeah? And it's really fascinating, isn't it? Because TripAdvisor basically means that we trust the opinion of 10,000 people who don't know anything more than we trust the opinion of one expert. Yeah? And a similar thing has happened with heritage. You know, the Egon Ronay, as it were, of heritage is, of course, Nicholas Pevsner. If you wanted to know what is valuable in terms of our heritage, our built environment, all you had to do was find the relevant volume of Pevsner's Buildings of England and look it up, and if it was in Buildings of England, it was great. And it was heritage, and it was worth saving. And a lot of the stuff that Pevsner liked was, you know, kind of like this. Easton Neston. And this was from the period, Pevsner was very much the great example of the period in which the heritage was dominated by highly intellectual architectural historians. They were the custodians. They defined what heritage was, and we all accepted that. But then there came the huge disruption, as it were, the TripAdvisor of heritage. And that happened all because of the growth of smartphones. What smartphones enabled people to do was not only to have an opinion, but to find other people with similar opinions. And then those opinions could be agglomerated, and they would become a hugely powerful force. And the greatest effect this had on the heritage, the most significant sign that everything was going to change, was to do with Preston Bus Station, which is a brutalist piece of architecture, OVR Associates and Building Design Partnership, designed in the late 1960s. And Preston Council, around 2000, wanted to demolish it because they thought it was hideous and it was in the way. And much to their surprise, the people of Preston thought, hang on, why do you want to tear that down? We think it's a fabulous building. And through social media, largely, they waged a campaign year after year to save this building, which culminated in 2013 when this was listed grade 2 by English Heritage. It was recently voted the most loved building in Preston. As a result of that, the council had to rethink all their plans, and this is now being redeveloped as a centerpiece of the new downtown Preston. This is the great example of how heritage is going to be redefined by the public and no longer by the experts. That, of course, puts a huge burden on all of us who love the heritage and who work in heritage organizations, because if the public are going to increasingly define what heritage is, we want to make sure they know what they're talking about. So it means that education and outreach and explanation and interpretation are going to be more important than ever, because people will no longer merely accept what the experts tell them. Now, the heritage is a very broad church, and it's getting broader and broader all the time because of this democratization of authority. We often think of heritage in terms of, the industrial heritage, for example, stately homes, parish churches, and so on. The movable heritage, transport heritage, is an extraordinarily important part of this country's story. I spoke to the Association of British Historic Motor Vehicle Clubs about 6 months ago. They have 260,000 members. So the movable heritage, whether it's automobiles or railways or canal boats, is very important. We've also got this thing now which is called the intangible heritage. And intangible heritage is about how we do things. And so that includes, Morris dancing. Not my favorite pastime, but I, enjoy seeing it on the right village green. Morris dancing is very important as a bit of preservation, cultural preservation. Heritage crafts are hugely important. Some heritage crafts are now down to fewer than 10 practitioners. So we really need to work on preserving heritage crafts from thatching onwards. And of course, there's even heritage baking. And we remember how the Chancellor attempted to impose a pasty tax and was beaten back. And I wrote to him afterwards and said, well, look, as you've saved the edible heritage, how about trying to save the built heritage? Because at the same time, the government imposed full-rate VAT on repair and maintenance of historic buildings, which was not terribly helpful. Globalization. Globalization is something that is hugely influential on the way we think about heritage. And really the consequences of globalization tend to be that every place looks the same and every place wants to offer the same amenities. So at the very top end, every city with some pretensions of grandeur wants to have one of these. Every other city settles for one of these. But we see the same branding and the same physical look on all our high streets, and this has led, and this is a particular problem in Britain because of the way our real estate industry is structured, and it's led to these clone zone high streets where everything looks the same. And of course, globally, we have these cloney cities. So Dubai, Shanghai, or maybe it's Shanghai, Dubai. There's not a great deal of difference, is there? And I took my children on a holiday to one of those places in the Gulf, and which was very luxurious. And at the end of the holiday, we were sitting in the departure lounge at the airport. I asked them how they enjoyed the holiday, and remarkably, considering how many pina coladas were on room service, remarkably, they said, "Daddy, can you please never take us here again?" Which surprised me, and I said, "Why?" And my eldest daughter said, "Because there's nothing here." So in a world, in the globalized world, which is essentially a sort of placeless world, heritage represents this incredibly powerful antidote to placelessness, because heritage is about a particular place. So what are the main heritage values? Well, to me, heritage tells us where we are. It's very place specific. It tells us who we are, because it's about our history and the way we've got to where we are. And I think most importantly, and this is quite often missing from discussions about heritage, it tells us what we can be. And we should never forget the inspirational value of heritage. So heritage is about location, identity, and inspiration. I went to a conference where they were agonizing over how to get young people interested in engineering. And I said, well, what about showing them Clifton Suspension Bridge? Don't you think that'd help? Or the Ironbridge? I mean, how many people can be inspired by that? So we've got to remember, you know, whenever anyone says to those of us who's interested in heritage, oh, it's all about nostalgia, it's all about looking backwards, that is a load of baloney. Because it's about looking towards the future, and it's about inspiration for future generations. So the big strengths of heritage in the globalized world, in the world of fake news and post-truth, heritage is the truth. Heritage is authenticity. It's also a driver for the economy, and it's about putting the magic back in. Tourism. I'm American, so I can share this. We all know tourism is the 5th largest industry in this country. And what's the asset that drives tourism? Not our sandy beaches, not our endless sunshine. What drives tourism is our heritage. 2/3 of tourists come here for the history and heritage. And I'm always amazed when the government talks about infrastructure projects, and they think that infrastructure is really about railways and airports and things. Well, heritage in this country, heritage is infrastructure. Heritage is the basis of almost everything that we do in this country and everything that we do well in this country. So tourism brings in so much money, and it can't keep bringing it in unless we, including the government, invest in the asset base, and the asset base is the heritage. Heritage also gives us the context in which people actually quite like making money, and it is one of the reasons why London tenaciously remains one of the financial centers of the world in spite of everything, because, you know, do you want to be in Frankfurt? Or do you want to be in London? And one of the attractions of London, of course, is the fabulous heritage context. And we know that people, for example, startup businesses that work in historic buildings are more successful and more productive than startup businesses that work in brand new buildings. So heritage has real economic power, which we shouldn't forget about. Now, authenticity. One of the great things about heritage is you can't fake it, and you really can't move it very well. By the way, this is not Paris. That is not really a picture of Paris. That's Paris as conceived in Las Vegas. And you know something? It doesn't really work, because heritage is very much about a specific place and about expressing the spirit of the place and the values of the place. Authenticity is also about real, tangible social experience. Grumpy Cat is frequently to be found. His books, I think Grumpy Cat is a he, his books are frequently found in the New York Times bestseller list. And this puzzled me. But we all know that apparently when people go into work and they're sitting in their offices looking at their computers, rather than doing work, they're watching amusing cat videos. And Grumpy Cat is the Brad Pitt of cat video stars. Now, so people spend endless hours watching cat videos. Now, what is this event? It's not Glastonbury. It's not Wembley. This is the International Cat Video Festival, which takes place every year in Minneapolis, and it attracts thousands and thousands of people to watch the same videos they've been watching all year on their desktops. And the reason they come to this festival is to be together, is to experience something social, is to transform something virtual into something that more closely approximates reality. So tangibility and sociability and authenticity are things that people are desperate for in the virtual world. Another great example of that is the fact that, we can all play chess. We can all play chess on our smartphones. Physical sales of chess sets have never been higher because, stimulated by the digital world, people want the real experience. So let's not forget about the value of the real experience, and the real experience is what heritage has. Now, in terms of policy, what can we get the government to do? What should governments do to help heritage? Well, this is the sort of wish list of the Heritage Alliance, and it all makes very good sense. Will any of these things ever be adopted as government policy? Well, that's a really interesting question because government is permanently distracted. And heritage always seems to be the icing on the cake. Governments always tend to say, yeah, heritage is great. When we can afford it, we'll do something for heritage. But they don't realize that the constant neglect of heritage is eroding many of our great national assets, many of our national values, and our sense of citizenship. So we always have a wish list of stuff that we want the government to do, and it's important to keep asking. In the crazy world that we find ourselves in, stability, tradition, history, the achievements of the past, whether they're embodied in a person or in a place, are hugely important. And it's really interesting, you can't imagine Paddington Bear. You can't imagine him without Paddington Station. And that's just, one example, one tiny example of how in this country, the heritage is inextricably bound up with every single aspect of our culture. Our universities, our great cultural institutions, they're almost all in significant heritage buildings. So heritage is something that is in our national DNA, and we have to recognize the contribution it makes to our national strength. I'm just going to leave with a sort of counterintuitive thought from this gloomy-looking German philosopher and sociologist, Max Weber. And Max Weber, when he was struggling with the meaning of the Great War, Max Weber was trying to define what it meant to be modern. And he came up with this idea that being modern was about living in a disenchanted world, a world in which everything could be rationally explained. And then if we all lived in that world, we would never have a war again, and it would be marvelous. Well, the thing about heritage is, and a lot of people are now getting involved in this idea of re-enchantment, about putting the magic back into society, about putting the inexplicable back into a joyous part of our life. And more than anything, it's heritage that can bring us joy, it can bring us magic, and it can bring us inspiration. Thank you very much indeed. And are we going to do some questions?
Some questions, no. Yes,
yeah. So ask.
Question,
Yeah. Ask any question you like. I might not answer it, but do ask.
Thank you for that. Rather than ask a question, can I make a statement? In your list of things, you didn't ask who we were. That was the first thing. The second thing, our son travelled the world taking photographs of bridges, including some of yours in America, that are very impressive. And he then displayed them in 2-foot displays. None of them were as nice as Ironbridge. No questions, that's just a statement.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. And by the way, I'm a very keen Brexiteer. Sorry to disappoint you.
But no, it's not a question. I mean, look, Brexit was merely I was citing it as a very disruptive thing. Some people think it's very positive, some people think it's very negative. But whatever you think, it's very disruptive one way or another. And it's changing things.
Oh, hello, Loyd. I'm a very passionate pro-European, so we'll have a fight afterwards. I'm struck, thank you very much for the lecture, but I'm very much struck that you couldn't cover everything, but you haven't touched on the role of education. And although there are numerous awards, Heritage Education Awards, that you'll know well, you've probably presented some of them, it struck me very forcibly the other night, and I was at an event at the People's History Museum in Manchester last weekend, and the subject matter was about the Second World War prisoner of war camps, when my father had been a prisoner of war, and I was in a taxi and going back from Salford Quays, and the guy said to me, "Oh, where have you been? What have you been doing?" And I said, "I've been at this thing. It's for the relatives of all the people who were held at Stalag 8B. My father was there, and we're in England." And he said, "Oh, what side was your father on?" And I said, "Well, he was English. He was from Yorkshire." "Yes, but what side was he fighting for?" And then I found myself explaining about the Second World War. This was not a particularly young taxi driver. And listening to you now, it just occurred to me, what would you say was the role of education in the broad heritage education, let alone the fact that in terms of post-Brexit, museums, galleries and tourism are all on those impact studies, by the way.
Yeah.
Hope you can get hold of one of them.
Yeah. Well, I think education, I didn't mention education specifically, other than to say that it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we have an educated public, because otherwise our heritage is not sustainable, nor will the public be able to get the pleasure and the joy and the inspiration out of it that we all do. But, without question, education is implicit, is one of the pillars of the whole heritage sector. And I think we've seen the most extraordinary progress in both museums and heritage sites in terms of the way they're used for education, in terms of outreach, and education not just being about kids, but being kind of lifelong education. I think it would be, we who love heritage would be helped hugely if the national curriculum for history was better. I remember one of my daughters and a friend of hers, both at this, pretty sort of hothouse school, doing their homework on the kitchen table, and they were doing history. And one of them said to me, not my daughter, but her friend said to me, did the Romans come before the Victorians, or was it the other way around? Because, of course, chronology is kind of a dirty word. So, yes, education is absolutely vital, and I'm pleased to see that there is such a great stress on education throughout the whole of the sector.
I was very interested in your first part when you were talking about the social impact of people trying to protect heritage. And we have an interesting situation here in the Gorge where we have a large power station. I don't know whether you saw it when you drove in. And there are 4 cooling towers there. And they're very iconic because they're actually coloured pink. And that's very unusual. And that was deliberately chosen to blend in with the environment. And for a lot of people here, they're almost as symbolic as the bridges. And they are due to be demolished next year. And there's a great drive locally to maintain them, to keep them. But there's been a consistent rejection of any idea of them being listed. And I just wondered how you felt about this, that local people are trying to get things like that listed, because to them, they are very, very important.
I mean, I think there should be, the whole listing system, and I say this with a little bit of trepidation because there are people in the audience who know a lot more about it than I do, the whole listing system needs to be relooked at. Because, you know, it was devised whenever, I think, in the late 1940s, and there's a lot that needs to be fixed with it. I would like to see a much greater amount of localism in listing. I think listing could be much more of a bottom-up thing than a top-down thing. And, you know, if people feel that those cooling towers are an important part of their lives here, I think they should be listed. But you're back to the Preston bus station, where, you know, that campaign, they campaigned for something like 10 years. And it's hard. It is hard. Especially if there are alternate development plans, because quite often developers, of course, have much more focus, much more concentration, much greater resources than small groups of citizens. But, you know, I'm all in favor of people deciding locally what they value.
Hi, that was a fascinating talk, and it's brought home a few things to me. I work in the Ironbridge Museum, so I'm very familiar with a lot of the issues and the things that we talk about, particularly in not being scared of the digital, because it can attract the real visitor, because they want to experience the real thing, and I think that's something we should embrace more. Being involved in the museum world, I obviously have a large part of what we think about and how we can influence different levels of government, from local councils right through to the top. But what would you say on a personal level? What should individuals be doing to be those influencing people and make more of an impact now that maybe the government is stepping back a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very important for as many people as possible to do things like join friends groups and join the other organizations that are heritage-y type of organizations. I'm sure that most of the people in this room probably belong to the National Trust. It is a well-known fact that more people belong to heritage bodies than all the political parties combined by a great factor. So joining and supporting all the organizations, you know, whether it's your local museum, whether it's the Friends Group or some other amenity society, is hugely important because there is weight in numbers. And also that old thing of letting your MPs know that you care. I mean, it really is extraordinary how influential even a relatively small group of people can be when they make their MPs aware of heritage issues. So there's no magic bullet. And indeed, you know, we have to remember, and this has been the case since the heritage movement started, you know, it is a fight. And those of us who love heritage go out and fight every day. And, you know, on the one hand, we're fighting against the usual stuff like gravity and the weather and all the things that ruin old buildings. Well, on the other hand, we're fighting against greed, we're fighting against ignorance, and we're fighting against indifference, and it's something that will never stop. Are we allowed to have a glass of wine now? One more question. Okay, let's have a really, really intense one.
Sorry to keep you from your glass of wine.
Thank you, Les.
It's a short question. I don't know how long the answer might be. The benefits, the economic benefits of heritage in terms of tourism are indisputable. You made a very good case for that, and we share that. But a place like the Ironbridge Gorge is very fragile when it comes to the impact of tourism, and it could so easily be destroyed. And we've seen places where, you know, the tourists, by their very numbers, have destroyed the thing that tourists come to see. Yeah. So do you have any particular thoughts on that?
that is such a sort of profound question, because we need to look at, the greatest example of the greatest heritage being destroyed by the weight of numbers is, of course, Venice. And if anyone is waiting to go to Venice, if you haven't been yet, go soon, because it is just being crushed by the weight of numbers of low-value tourists who get decanted from cruise ships, spend the day walking around, go back on the cruise ships, haven't put anything into the local economy other than the mooring fees for the cruise ships. And Venice is such a tourist attraction that it is impossible for local people to live there because the prices of flats are so high. So it's effectively become depopulated, population of under 60,000. And it's kind of the most beautiful dead city on earth. And it's an object lesson of how you can so mismanage heritage. Years ago, there were proposals to charge visitors, a daily rate for visiting Venice, and this caused a great deal of outrage. And in the case of Venice, that was probably quite a good idea. How you ration heritage, other than through pricing, is a problem for so many of us. I mean, for example, I'm chairman of the Royal Parks. We get 77.7 million visitors a year, which is fantastic. And, parks should be open free to everyone all the time. There's no question about that. But huge numbers of visitors cause a lot of soil compaction. They damage trees that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. Just the weight of millions of footsteps can be very damaging to any historic building. So weight of numbers is something that significant heritage attractions are very worried about indeed. Ironbridge Gorge is fortunate in a way because even though it is a fragile environment, there are a number of attractions to spread the weight of numbers out. However, it's getting in and out of the gorge that I think probably causes the greatest number of problems. A lot of it can be addressed by marketing and trying to get people not only to come at peak times, but unfortunately or fortunately for heritage attractions, the mass of people are going to come when the weather is good, they're going to come during school holidays, and I don't think anyone has a simple solution to that.
Well, thank you very much, Loyd. There was so much to unpack in your presentation. Two things came to my mind. One is the French have this wonderful term which doesn't translate well in English called valorization. And I translate it as making heritage work for us. And I think the sooner people actually realize that, the better. The other thing is, somebody once said to me, just in passing when I was in Jorvik when it first opened, they said, heritage is the gateway to the past. And I flip that and I say, no, it's the entry point to the future. And I think it's a very, very, Loyd demonstrated this, we need to turn some of these things on its head. So I'd like to thank you very much, Loyd, for a fascinating talk. And because it is Halloween, we've decided to give you a treat rather than a trick. So we'd like to present you with this small token of our esteem. And I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of the Ironbridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage and on behalf of the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust for joining us for this wonderful lecture by Loyd. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for that.
Smashing. And a glass of wine can be had, I think.
Yes, onwards.
That was great, Loyd.
Oh, what am I muted now?
Society, God save Donald Duck, vaudeville and variety. We are the Desperate Dan Appreciation Society. What more can we do? We are the Draft Beer Preservation Society. God save Mrs. Moore, a good old Mother Riley. We are the Custard Pie Appreciation Consortium. God save the George Cross and all those who were awarded that. We are the Sherlock Holmes English-speaking vernacular. Help save Fu Manchu, Moriarty and Dracula. We are the Office Block Persecution Affinity.